Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different.
Morning began with a damp smell of salt and milk. The sea was a gray mirror beneath the cliffs, and gulls cut through the mist with their cries, impatient, as if demanding their share of whatever the tide would bring. In the small house leaning against the slope above the harbor, a thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney, steady and blue. Inside, the child's hands moved slowly at first, then with a rhythm learned by imitation rather than confidence. Lace was not born from threads alone. Patience wove its borders tighter than any knot her fingers could tie. Her aunt watched from the hearth, counting the measures of lace stretched over the bobbins, and muttered that even clumsy work could feed a mouth if done cleanly. The girl listened without answering. She had learned that silence kept peace longer than speaking. The sound of clicking wooden spools filled the air like the ticking of a clock, though they owned none.
The day was marked by chores, water carried from the well, weaving, sweeping, and later walking down to the beach to collect bits of driftwood for fire. The village was small, its houses packed close as mussel shells on a rock. At dusk, smoke from a dozen chimneys mingled and drifted across the slope, softening the edges of roofs and chimneys. Fish scales glittered under the doors where men cleaned their catch. Loud talk came from the road by the tavern, but at the house, only the low voice of prayer cut through the quiet before sleep. Each evening, her aunt murmured to the saints, hands folded hard, naming those lost to the sea. The child listened for the pauses between the names, alert for her father's, but it never came. The silence stretched, heavy as the tide after storm. In winter, when the wind pressed against the shutters, the girl imagined the sea beyond the hill, growing wild in darkness. Work continued even when storms howled. The lace cushion lay in her lap, heavy with pins. The threads crossed in subtle order, pale against the coarse brown of her apron. Sometimes she pricked her finger, and a small bead of red bloomed, which she wiped away quietly before her aunt noticed. It seemed wrong that such fineness depended on pain. On Sundays, she went with the others to Mass in a stone church crouched against the wind. Its bell had a salt-eaten voice, cracked but enduring. The priest's sermon drifted over her head like mist. She caught only fragments about faith, toil, and humility. Afterward, old women knelt at the shrine of St. Anne, whispering of fishing nets, husbands, and storms to come. Out in the churchyard, men smoked in silence, their faces half turned toward the sea. It was said no one born in that village ever truly left it, for the sea called every name sooner or later.
The first joy of her childhood came with color. The day her aunt traded a basket of lace for a spool of blue thread, imported from somewhere beyond the horizon. It gleamed like a promise. The girl turned it in her palm and thought how strange it was that beauty came packaged in such small things. Her aunt told her to save it for a customer, but she kept a tiny length for herself, hidden in a wooden box near her bed. At night, she unwound it under candlelight, watching the blue shine faintly, dreaming of places where fabric and skies might share that same shade. Life passed in seasons of labor. Spring brought the smell of herbs hanging from rafters. Summer burned the air dry and filled their room with flies. In autumn, boats loaded with sardines brought more noise than the church bell. In winter, hunger came quietly, masked in thrift and habit. Yet she saw a certain order in it, a pattern as deliberate as the lace she made. Strangers called it poverty. To her, it was simply the texture of time. Children of fishermen teased her for working indoors, calling her candle girl. They laughed that lace could not fill a stomach. She watched them run toward the pier, envying their freedom, though secretly she pitied them. Their fathers gambled on the winds. Hers rested somewhere under the waves. The aunt would say, half bitter, that men chase risk because they cannot bear stillness. The girl thought she understood that, though she herself feared the sea's power more than its mystery. Each year, the fair arrived in the nearest town. Her aunt sent her once with an older neighbor to sell lace. It was the farthest she had ever walked. The road was lined with heather and puddles, and the smell of tar and horses was foreign but exciting. At the fair, stalls of cloth and copper dishes dazzled her. She remembered one woman wearing a bonnet embroidered with gold thread. Real gold, they said. The price of that bonnet could feed their house for months. Yet the woman's eyes were dull, detached, as though she carried the weight of her ornaments rather than pleasure. The girl returned home puzzled, wondering if wealth might be its own kind of labor. By her 12th year, her hands grew steady enough to match her aunt's speed. She began to make patterns without instruction, inventing small designs shaped like waves or wings. The aunt noticed and scolded her for wasting time. Buyers wanted tradition, not fancy ideas. Still, one afternoon when light poured through the west window, the older woman paused, holding a finished piece up to judge the work. She said nothing, only nodded once, a rare thing, and the girl felt an unspoken pride settle warmly in her chest. It was the first approval that did not feel like survival, but something nearer to blessing. Sometimes she imagined what lay beyond the dunes. Sailors spoke of islands where trees bore fruit without care, and the air smelled of cinnamon. She kept those whispers like trinkets, stored away against dull evenings. Yet, even then she sensed such tales belonged to others, not to girls who measured thread and watched the tide retreat, leaving behind broken shells and bits of glass polished by the water's patience. Adventure, in her world, wore humbler clothes, the challenge of making each new length of lace cleaner than the last, of keeping hope alive in a place where the wind could blow it out like a match. On clear nights, the stars hung low, so near they seemed to rest upon the mast tops. Her aunt would cross herself and shut the shutters, muttering that too many bright nights summoned wrecks. The child lay awake, listening to the waves grinding against the cliffs, half believing the sea itself held its own form of will, jealous
watchful, pulling back what mankind borrowed from it. She learned fear not as sudden panic, but as quiet respect. The sea took what it wanted, and the land simply adjusted around the loss.
In that small house above the harbor, years began to feel circular. One task blending into the next, one tide into another. Yet within her, something kept stitching itself stronger, not rebellion, but the faint outline of a wish. If there was power in making lace fine enough to please strangers, perhaps there was also power in seeing what others ignored. The hidden symmetries of daily life, the way sunlight through a bobbin's glass bead cast a pattern on the table like frozen music. She did not yet have words for it, but she had begun, quietly, to think. So the child grew among threads and salt, within a narrow world bound by custom and weather, learning the first truth that would follow her always, that beauty, even when born of hardship, makes its own kind of freedom. And though she could not know it, every length of lace she completed traced the same impossible longing that one day would lead her to stand at her window, watching a ship break upon the rocks, and wonder what message the sea might send her next. The air above the harbor carried the bitter scent of seaweed and charcoal. Fishing boats tilted on the tide like tired beasts, their sails patched and heavy after the long season. In the narrow streets, women bent over baskets of mackerel, calling prices in voices roughened by salt and wind. Among them walked the lacemaker, a folded length of linen under her arm, her own work, pale and fine, meant for the merchant's wife who lived near the quay. The hem trembled slightly in her grasp, not from fear, but the uncommon feeling of walking alone to sell what her hands had made. The cottage she rented stood near the slope, above a shoemaker, and across from a deserted warehouse that creaked in the wind. A single window faced the harbor, its frame warped but still sturdy enough to keep out the worst of the rain. There, by lamplight, she worked through most nights, her fingers guiding bobbins in a rhythm that half resembled prayer. The lace cushions, the wooden stool, the scent of wax, all she owned could fit in one corner, yet to her it was a private realm, where threads replaced words and silence measured worth. The merchant's wife received her work with polite detachment, barely glancing at the pattern before offering a few silver coins. The sum was fair by local standards, but scarcely enough for the hours spent. Still, when the coins rested in her palm, they carried a sense of quiet triumph. For the first time she had earned money with no oversight save her own. The aunt had passed years earlier, buried near the church wall where grass never grew thick. And though grief had dulled, the absence lingered like a missing shadow when she entered the house at dusk. Life had settled into a pattern as detailed as her lace: steady labor, careful economy, rare company. She rented her room from a widow who sold herbs by the pier, a pragmatic woman with sharp elbows and soft heart, who filled their evenings with talk of healing plants, fair weather signs, and unkind spirits lurking between tides. The widow swore that fishermen who ignored the moon's pull were bound to misfortune. The lacemaker did not argue. In this village, disbelief was an expensive luxury.
Among those who frequented the harbor was a fisherman named Eves, whose laughter carried farther than the gulls. He mended nets in front of his hut and occasionally shared a loaf or a story, speaking of a boat he hoped to buy one day, a small cutter painted green to carry cargo between the coves. He claimed he would name it after a saint, or perhaps after her, half jesting, half warm-eyed. She met such words with amusement and a caution born from habit.
His cheerfulness compensated for his lack of money, but ambition in men often drifted away like smoke once the sea called again. The days turned repetitive, yet quietly contented. The rhythm of work filled spaces where conversation might have hung. In the mornings, she washed lace in a basin of cold water, the fabric floating like fragile foam. By afternoon, she sat by the window to mend or measure. In the evenings, she watched the lights across the bay flicker into being. It was not happiness as poets described, yet it was a life she knew how to endure, modest, predictable, and her own. Some evenings she even found comfort in the dim hum of the tavern below, its distant laughter like music from another, more daring world. With time her skill brought notice. Captains' wives came in from surrounding villages, demanding finer thread, richer detail. The lace traveled farther than she did, to parish churches, to weddings she would never attend, even rumored to reach a prefect's household inland. She wondered if those women, draped in lace as fine as mist, sensed the hunger and perseverance stitched into every loop. Work, she thought, bore the maker's soul within it, even when the customer saw only decoration. The widow one day introduced her to a merchant who traded in linens. He spoke of opportunities. Lace could travel by ship, reaching Nantes, perhaps even farther. His tone mingled kindness with calculation. She listened carefully, distrust soft behind her smile. Years had taught her that offers of help often carried an unseen price, yet she accepted the contact, willing at least to let her handiwork sail where she never could. That evening she walked the pier with Eve. He carried a small lantern and spoke of tides and luck. "You trust too easily," he said, but there was affection in his warning. She thought of those words later, lying awake as the wind pressed against her shutters. Trust was necessary to live. Withholding it entirely would hollow a person more efficiently than hunger. Still, she resolved to be wary with merchants and confide only in those whose words came without promise of gain. By spring, her earnings allowed modest comforts: a second candle, a jar of honey, a scarf dyed deep green. The village saw and whispered that she was doing well for a woman alone. In truth, doing well meant she could pay rent on time and fill the stove before nightfall. But the pride those things gave her was real, and it softened the weight she carried. Even laughter returned, small, private bursts, when a pattern turned out perfectly, or when a child in the street tried to mimic her movements with clumsy fingers. As months unwound, letters from traveling merchants began arriving, marked with smudged ink and strange seals. They praised her work, requested more, and sent promises of payment with the next delivery. Some never paid, others sent half, yet she was drawn to the sense of invisible connection those letters carried. Somewhere, on roads she might never see, her lace lay folded in trunks beside silk and spices. The thought enlarged her narrow room, teaching her that creation could cross miles, even when its maker could not. Yet life, steady as it seemed, had its cracks. One autumn night, Eves returned injured from a storm, his boat broken,
his savings gone. For weeks he limped between tavern and beach, his laughter dimmed. She tended his wounds quietly, binding them with strips torn from old fabric, listening to his bitterness with patient silence. When he spoke of leaving the village to fish elsewhere, she wished him luck instead of pleading, knowing words could not anchor a restless man. He kissed her hand before dawn and promised to send word. None came. Work grew heavier that winter.
The tide dragged fewer boats to shore. Storms wrecked one after another. The price of bread rose. She learned to stretch her meals to cover 2 days. Still, she continued, her needles flashing even as cold stiffened her fingers. When she managed to finish a commission, she paid her rent, set a single candle on the table, and whispered to herself that survival was a kind of victory. The widow called her stubborn. She called it practice. In rare moments of leisure, she walked the edge of the cliffs where grass bent flat from constant wind. Below, the surf foamed in luminous lines. There, she thought of all who had gone. Her aunt, her father, the fishermen claimed by waves. Yet, instead of grief, she felt something almost calm. To live beside the sea was to understand that permanence was an illusion. One's duty was to keep mending the fragile fabric of life each day, stitch by stitch, until it held again, however briefly. When spring finally cleared the chill, she carried her finished lace to the harbor. Sunlight glimmered on the water, turning it silver. She paused on the steep path, the linen bright in her hands. It struck her how light the bundle was compared to the hours it contained. Labor had a strange way of dissolving into the air, leaving only beauty behind. In that thought, she found her first quiet sense of dignity. The realization that value might exist separate from recognition, that honest work, once done, belonged as much to time as to trade. Evening found her by the window once more, the cushion in her lap, the shutter half open to the smell of tide. She could hear faint singing from the tavern below, and gulls circling unseen above the roofs. The coins from the day's sale rested on the table. They were not many, but they were hers, free of debt or favor. For a moment, she felt both small and entirely alive, as if the stillness around her had leaned in to listen. The lace grew beneath her fingers, intricate and strong, and somewhere inside that pattern lay the quiet beginning of every story yet to come. Night fell without ceremony. Clouds rolled low over the bay, heavy enough to hide the moon, and the wind pressed against the shutters like an impatient visitor. The lacemaker worked by lamplight, the wick trimmed short to save oil. Her fingers moved weary but sure, binding fine thread into pattern as the storm began to shake the rafters. It was the kind of weather seamen feared, the kind her aunt used to call the sea's reckoning. The house trembled in its frame, and from her window she could see only darkness pierced by white flashes of foam at the rocks below. She rose to fasten the latch, but as she did, a glimmer caught her eye. Far out, beyond the headland, where the currents met, a light, moving unsteadily, bobbing, then gone. Another flash followed, brighter, then two together, as if someone on a vessel signaled for help. She knew those waters. No ship with sense would sail there in rising wind. Yet the light burned again, then vanished in a shudder of lightning.
A hollow sound reached her soon after, a distant crack, unmistakable, wood meeting rock. For a time she could not move. The sea roared in her ears, louder than the wind by her door. Within moments, the bell from the harbor began to toll, slow and irregular. Men were already mustering. She could hear their shouts through the storm. Still, she stayed at her window, eyes narrowed against the rain streaking the glass, knowing she was useless to them and unwilling to face the waves that had taken too much already. The lamp flickered. Her reflection flickered with it, pale, thin, watchful. When dawn came, gray and raw, she had not slept. By morning the wind had quieted, leaving the beach scattered with wreckage. Half the village was gathered there, peering among splintered boards, coils of rope, torn cloth. The men spoke in bursts, half in awe, half in fear. A foreign ship, they said, judging by its cargo and build. No survivors found. The customs officer kept everyone back from the main debris, muttering about paperwork and authority, while the fishermen exchanged dark glances. Shipwrecks meant salvage, but also suspicion. Too often the line between rescue and theft was thin enough to drown in. She walked the shoreline after the crowd thinned. Seaweed clung to the stones, tattered sails draped across the rocks like enormous shrouds. Under her boots, the sand was darkened with fish oil and coal dust. She found nothing at first beyond splinters and rope, until her foot struck something solid, half buried in wet sand. A small piece of polished wood, no longer than her forearm. She bent down and lifted it carefully. The surface bore shallow carvings, lines and dots arranged in an uneven pattern, rubbed smooth by the sea. A fragment of some ornament, perhaps, or a token. Yet there was a deliberateness in the marks that caught her breath, too akin to thread crossings, too measured to be mere decoration. She wiped it clean and tucked it under her cloak before returning home. The widow who rented her the room questioned her about the commotion, certain some local men would try claiming valuables before the officials did. She agreed absently, promising to stay clear of the mess, though her thoughts kept circling back to the carved driftwood now resting beneath her work table. That night, after the bell had fallen silent and the wind moved out to sea again, she took the fragment into the lamplight. The marks seemed to shift under her gaze, faint as embroidery seen through sheer fabric. She traced them with a needle's tip, half expecting them to form letters, but they resisted sense, only rhythm. For days the village spoke of little else. Rumors swelled that the ship carried contraband, that it belonged to English traders, that it smuggled relics or gold. The customs officer posted 2 guards by the rocks, yet somehow small items still vanished. A silver compass, a crate of cloth, a metal figurine shaped like a bird. The widow recalled seeing strangers on horseback the night after the wreck, though no one else confirmed it. When asked, she shrugged and said that the dead held their secrets better than the living. The lacemaker carried her own secret in silence. In daylight she worked as always, yet often her eyes drifted toward the hidden plank. Some instinct told her its story touched more than luck or foolish navigation. Each pattern she wove reminded her of it, this code of wood and salt that seemed to mirror her craft. One evening she showed it to a priest who came to bless homes near the harbor. He examined it under the faint churchyard light, murmured that it might be a foreign cipher or sign used by merchants, then handed it back with a polite warning not to meddle in what belonged to the sea. He blessed her door and went on. That night,
His words rang hollow against her curiosity. Something in her resisted the idea that mystery and danger should belong only to men. She thought of Eve's, still absent, and of countless faces taken by water. The sea gave and took as it pleased. But this object, worn and deliberate, felt different, as though it had waited to be found. Once she caught herself placing it beside her lace cushion, noticing how the linear carvings echoed the threads stretched taut between pins. Both spoke a language of crossings. One made to adorn, the other perhaps to conceal. The following week, a man from the customs office visited her to commission lace for his sister's wedding. He mentioned, offhand, that the wrecked ship might have carried goods from the Channel Islands. "Smugglers," he said, lowering his voice. "They hide code in everything. Letters, carvings, even fabric. You'd be surprised." The comment slid past her politeness, but lodged somewhere deeper, refusing to leave. That night she unrolled a piece of linen and began copying the carved shapes onto it with her smallest needle, stitch by stitch, until they lay before her like a faint echo of the sea's own handwriting. Days turned into weeks. The wreck faded from gossip as other matters grew urgent, a shortage of salt, a dispute over fishing grounds. Yet within her, the quiet intrigue only deepened. The coded piece of wood became her talisman. Whenever fatigue or monotony pressed too hard, she looked at it and felt an unnameable pull, as though she were being asked a question by something beyond the reach of language. One morning she walked the headland alone, carrying her basket for driftwood. The air was still. Gulls circled low, crying lazily. On the rocks where the waves had dashed the ship, remnants still clung. A broken mast, a stretch of rope, a few nails shining faintly in the sun. She crouched beside them, tracing the cracks where barnacles had begun to settle. For a moment, she thought she glimpsed another carved piece half buried, but when she reached out, it broke under her touch, only splintered bark. Still, she lingered there, hands resting on damp stone, feeling both foolish and strangely alive. Back home, she turned the fragment in her hands one last time, before hiding it inside the drawer beneath her linens. Whatever message it held was not ready to speak, yet the silence it carried changed how she looked at her own work. Each thread's intersection seemed charged with possibility, each knot a choice. The lace no longer served merely to decorate, but to record time, every hour given to it, every fleeting doubt. That evening, as rain began again against the glass, she set her lamp closer to the window. Beyond, the sea glimmered faintly, calm now, innocent, as if it had forgotten the storm. She knew better. The horizon, always shifting, held its own kind of memory. Somewhere out there, unseen, the rest of the ruined ship rested beneath a thin shroud of sand. It might never rise again, but a small, carved piece had drifted free, enough to alter the shape of her days. When the lamp finally burned low, she folded her tools away and stood for a long while by the window. The tide had begun to rise, curling white along the edge of the bay. It seemed to breathe rather than move, patient, sleepless, full of hidden stories. She thought of the priest's warning, of the customs man's careless remark, of Eve's laughter fading into absence. The world around her was a net of causes and secrets, and she sensed something waiting at its center, still unraveled. The storm had passed, but its echo remained, woven now not in wind or wave, but in her own unquiet heart. The season turned slowly.
as if reluctant to let go of the long gray rains. By the time spring arrived, the village wore its usual disguise of calm. Nets dried against cottage walls, and children searched the shore for shells bleached white as bone. To anyone passing through, the storm and its wreck might already have seemed a distant legend, softened by gossip and time. Yet inside the lacemaker's small house near the slope, its memory persisted, not in words spoken, but in the wooden fragment that lay hidden inside her work drawer. Each morning she rose before the harbor's first bell. The narrow room smelled of flax and ash. Her life resumed its quiet rhythm. Boil water, check thread, start the day's order. The widow downstairs complained that prices were rising again, that salt merchants had begun cheating on measures, that the parish priest spoke of unseen punishments waiting for those who profited from misfortunate seas. The lacemaker only nodded, barely listening. Her mind drifted back to the marks carved in the driftwood, and the feeling that they were waiting for her to understand them. Sometimes she would take it out in daylight, turning it to catch the light at different angles. The carvings resisted translation, yet she thought she began to discern patterns, not letters, but repetitions, as though the maker had meant to count something rather than spell it. There was rhythm. Long mark, 3 short. Pause. It reminded her of lace pricking, the first drawn grid upon which threads followed invisible logic until beauty appeared. She traced these incisions the same way, half believing they would somehow respond. Curiosity became her small rebellion. Each worry pressed upon her, the cost of candles, rent due soon, her hands aching from too many hours at the cushion. But when she looked at the fragment, the world widened again. It promised meaning beneath surface, not fortune, not rescue, but the pleasure of glimpsing how things truly connected. Few in her station had either freedom or time for thought. She took her chance quietly, behind drawn curtains. One afternoon, when wind carried the smell of thawing seaweed, a priest from the neighboring parish stopped by the widow's shop. He was younger than most, with thin spectacles and a sunburned face. The widow, always eager for conversation, invited him to tea and insisted her tenant join. Over steaming cups of chicory, talk turned to the shipwreck. The priest claimed the wreck's manifest had finally reached the prefecture. Bolts of silk, ivory combs, and crates unaccounted for. And yet, no bodies, he said, shaking his head. God alone knows what really traveled on that vessel. Later, as he prepared to leave, she asked, quietly, almost shyly, whether messages at sea ever used carved symbols instead of words. He considered her question a long while. Sailors are inventive, he said at last. They use mirrors, lanterns, flags. But carved code? Yes, I've seen it once. Certain companies trading secretly marked crates by system. A merchant's cipher, not a sailor's prayer. His gaze turned thoughtful. Why do you ask? She smiled faintly and said only that she'd seen something like it in a pattern once. The priest smiled back, perhaps not believing her, yet his words lingered long after he'd gone. A merchant's code. Commercial secrets, hidden not to keep faith, but to protect profit. Somehow that truth felt heavier than she expected, colder than superstition. The sea, she thought, took human cunning as readily as lives. In the days following, she began to notice subtle changes around the harbor. 2 officials arrived from the city, questioning ship owners and inspecting warehouses. The customs officer walked with a new stiffness, as though uneasy under scrutiny. Rumors stirred that certain men had been paid to keep silent, that not all wreckage had washed away. In the tavern, fishermen muttered of coins stamped with strange emblems found along the beach. Every half-truth deepened her unease.
Despite herself, she grew wary of who might see the driftwood piece if she kept it too carelessly. One night, she hid it behind a loose plank in the wall beside the small spool of blue thread she had kept since childhood. Together they seemed to form a pair of precious, incomprehensible symbols, one of beauty, one of mystery. Spring gave way to summer. Heat shimmered above the cobbles, the air thick with salt. The lacemaker's commissions increased again, the wedding season drawing wealthier customers. Among them was a young notary's wife, pale and restless, who ordered lace sleeves finer than mist and confided, during one fitting, that a fortune had been stolen from her husband's cousin in Nantes. Even high society, it seemed, suffered shipwrecks of a kind. At the market, voices rose loud over barrels of herring. The widow haggled as always, yet her eye often drifted toward the pier where townsfolk gathered at sunset. There stood the customs men, speaking tensely with strangers the locals did not know, well-dressed, unweathered by the sea. A sense of watching entered the air. The lacemaker began to feel it in her work itself. Each stitch had weight, each knot a small decision she could not easily undo. One afternoon, seeking a moment's air, she walked beyond the village toward the cliffs. The path was narrow but bright, lined with yellow gorse and wind-worn stones. From there, she could see the whole curve of the bay, neat and ordinary under the sun. No trace of wreckage remained, only calm silver water licking the rocks. Yet the peace seemed deceptive. She thought of the ship lying ruined below, its cargo bones scattered and buried beneath sand. Secrets, she realized, do not rot, they sink. She sat on a rock and opened her basket, pulling out a small scrap of lace she had begun for herself. Unlike her commissioned work, it bore no pattern from the market books. It wound loosely, like currents and eddies, following no design save her instinct. As her fingers worked, she found herself echoing the carvings again, the long and short rhythm she had memorized. When she finished, a faint symbol took shape in the fabric, fragile yet precise. It pleased her, though she could not say why. Perhaps crafting unknown meaning was the nearest one could come to choice. On her way back, she stopped by the churchyard. Children chased each other between leaning crosses. Old women sprinkled water over flowers. For a moment she imagined her aunt's grave among them, modest, ordinary. Yet her aunt had believed the world ended at the harbor wall, and here she was, still weaving consequences from a night beyond it. She left a sprig of gorse on the nearest stone and whispered no prayer. Toward dusk, the wind shifted. The smell of tar drifted from the quay. Men were loading barrels onto a new vessel headed inland. She watched from the narrow lane, hidden behind a fence of reeds. Among the barrels were several marked with crude scratches that made her heart quicken. Lines, dots, pauses, like the fragment in her wall. For a moment she feared somebody might look her way, but the workers moved on unaware. Whatever cipher the wreck had carried still lived in trade and secrecy. That night she unraveled the lace she had made on the cliff, afraid someone might notice its strange pattern. The thread piled in her lap like sea foam dissolving. Some mysteries, she thought, should be preserved unspoken. Yet even as she destroyed the cloth, the shape remained in her memory, unchanged.
She wrapped the loosened thread carefully around a pin and set it beside her spool of blue. The wind outside moaned through the roof seam, smelling of rain again. Before sleep, she sat a long time by the window, gazing at the faint line where horizon met night. There was no storm, no moon, only darkness stretching as far as the tide dared reach. Somewhere beyond it, ships still traded secrets, and men still guarded them with silence. In her lap, her hands rested lightly together, palms turned upward as though holding nothing at all. Yet in that stillness, she felt the quiet pulse of discovery, small but sure, like the tide deep beneath calm water, moving unseen, drawing her slowly toward whatever the sea intended her to learn. By late summer, the sea grew lazy again, stretched beneath long tides that glimmered like dull glass under the sun. The harbor quieted. Fishing boats rocked idly, their sails patched but still hopeful. The village slipped into that strange calm between seasons when gossip dries up, and even the gulls grow tired of shouting. It was during such days, when the air smelled of warm salt and damp rope, that the lacemaker first saw the stranger. He arrived alone, walking in from the southern road, carrying nothing but a canvas sack and a small brass compass that hung from his neck like a medallion. His manner was reserved, his clothes plain yet foreign in cut, heavy boots, a dark waistcoat, a collar frayed, but once fine. He rented a narrow room at the inn, second floor, looking toward the sea. That evening the widow mentioned him between mouthfuls of soup, half amused, half suspicious. "A sailor by walk," she said, "though not by smell, too clean for that." The next morning, the lacemaker found him sitting near the quay, sketching in a notebook while watching the ships. She passed without stopping, yet later she would recall the way he studied the water, not as one longing for it, but as one measuring it, taking its measure as an enemy might study a map. Days folded quietly afterward. Her work continued, lace for a wedding veil, trimming for a priest's vestment. But now and then she caught sight of the stranger, always near the harbor, sometimes talking with fishermen, once with the customs clerk. No one knew his purpose. The children dubbed him the man who reads the sea. She heard them chant it one afternoon as he offered them apples from his bag, smiling faintly, pretending not to understand their teasing. One evening, she found him standing before her cottage, tracing the shape of the cliffs in his notebook. He greeted her politely, his voice low and accented. He asked whether she lived alone. She said yes, cautiously. He explained that he was studying the coastline for navigation charts. Nothing secret, he added, only curious work for traders. When he noticed the lace cushion on her windowsill, he smiled. "You draw tales with thread," he said. "I draw them with lines." She said little, wary but not uncomfortable. It had been long since someone spoke to her without politeness, hiding suspicion. Over the next weeks, their paths crossed more often. He helped her carry water from the well one morning. Another time, he shared dried figs wrapped in paper, gifts from a port she had never heard named aloud. Their conversations were simple: weather, customs, the language of tides. True intimacy never passed between them, only fragments of it, like scattered pins in a pattern not yet formed. The village, ever alert to novelty, began to whisper. The widow warned her lightly to be careful. Men with compasses brought more trouble than love. The lacemaker smiled at the remark, but felt its quiet truth. Still, she found herself waiting for his steps by the lane each evening. pretending to fuss with her laundry so she might greet him without pretense. One afternoon he came to her door with an object wrapped in damp cloth. When she unrolled it, she drew breath. A small piece of driftwood, its carvings eerily similar to the one she had found months ago. The stranger squinted at her expression, then said gently, "So, you've seen this before." He showed her how the carvings aligned perfectly with a chart of nearby coves, each mark standing for a landing place or route known only to certain traders. His tone carried no accusation, only curiosity. She hesitated before retrieving her own fragment from its hiding place. The two pieces fit together along one edge like halves of a thought. Together they revealed a more intricate cipher, a rhythm of lines forming not merely a map, but something like an agreement, names scratched out, initials interlaced. The stranger nodded slowly, his gaze darkening. "Not ship cargo," he murmured. "Instructions, routes for smuggling." The words settled in the room heavily. She looked at him, trying to read intent beneath his calm. He rolled the pieces back into the cloth and handed them to her. "No need to fear. Some men profit from wrecks long before the sea breaks them. I came looking for such signs. Too many deaths blamed on weather that was never made by God." There was distance in his tone, but also a quiet resolve. In the days that followed, she thought often of his phrase, "weather never made by God." It carried a weight that unsettled her more than the code itself. The storm that had broken the ship returned to her memory, and for the first time she wondered if it had truly been chance. The stranger remained near the docks, his attention turning toward the customs officers, who now spoke less openly among themselves. The widow, ever tuned to gossip, noticed that certain men avoided their usual haunts. Once 2 of them rode out at night toward the cliffs, returning with their carts unmarked in the dawn. The village looked away. Everyone depended, one way or another, on unrecorded trade. Late one evening, the stranger came to her cottage again. Rain filled the street with short, intermittent drumming. He stood at the doorway holding his compass. The lamplight caught the glint of its glass cover. "They mean to move something," he said quietly. "Tonight or tomorrow. A shipment from the wreck, hidden in one of their stores." She asked what he planned to do. He looked around her small room, at the bobbins, the pattern pinned to the cushion. "Work leaves traces," he said slowly. "Men like these erase them." Then, almost to himself, "I only follow the threads they think lost." When he left, she could not sleep. Wind rattled the bamboo fencing outside. Each creak sounded like footsteps. She sat at her work table, but her hands were clumsy. On the cushion lay a narrow strip of lace half-finished, its design interrupted. She realized the pattern roughly echoed the marks from the wood, unintentionally perhaps, but too close to dismiss. The line of thread crossed, curved, looped back on itself, a quiet code of her own making. At dawn she went down to the harbor. The fog clung low over the water, pale as worn silk. The stranger was there, waiting near the pier. He lifted the compass once, then slipped it into his coat. Without a word, they began walking along the path toward the cliffs. The ground was slick, their breaths thin in the cold. Halfway there, voices echoed from below, the hard clatter of hooves and the sharp ring of metal on stone. They crouched behind the slope, watching shapes move faintly through the mist. 2 carts, 3 men, and the customs officer himself. They unloaded something wrapped, too large for ordinary cargo. Moments passed, each drawn out and heavy. Lightning flashed far out to sea, though the sky above them was clear. The stranger's jaw tightened. When the carts moved inland again, he whispered that the goods would likely vanish before nightfall, bound for another coast. His calm was drained now, replaced by a weary anger. She saw in it not the thrill of discovery, but the ache of justice too late. Back in the village, nothing looked different.
The tavern opened. The bell rang for fishing boats to depart. Women bartered over fish scales and onions. Yet everything felt thinner, more fragile, as if every word spoken had a hidden version beneath it. The stranger thanked her that evening, said little else, and promised to bring her thread from another port if he ever returned. He left the next morning before sunrise, his compass glinting faintly as he walked away down the damp road. From her window, the lacemaker watched until the mist swallowed him. Then she turned to her table, picked up her bobbins, and resumed her work. The sea's breathing reached faintly through the glass. The lace grew in her hands, pattern following pattern, quiet yet deliberate, until its design seemed almost secret even to her. Autumn arrived hard that year, rolling in on winds that tasted of iron and old storms. The air had changed. Everyone felt it. Voices lowered at the market. The tavern stayed quiet past dusk. The sea itself seemed to hold its breath, slow and deliberate beneath its slate-colored skin. To those with nothing to hide, it was only another turning season. But to those who carried secrets, the silence was caution in its purest form. The lacemaker worked longer than ever, not because orders grew, but because stillness unnerved her. Her fingers moved automatically now, her craft a shield against thoughts that pressed too close. The stranger had been gone for nearly a month, leaving behind only one object, his small brass compass set neatly on the table beside her tools. He had slipped it there the night before his departure, wordless, as though passing on a promise she had not agreed to keep. The compass was ordinary in design, the glass scuffed, the needle trembling as if uncertain which way was north. Yet sometimes, when the candle sank low, it caught stray light and glimmered with unsettling life. She hid it in a drawer, but its presence weighted the air, like a heartbeat trapped under the wood. Meanwhile, word spread that the customs clerk had fallen ill. His replacement, a tall man from Wren with sharp handwriting, quickly tightened the rules around the docks. He questioned the fishing crews, demanded new papers for every shipment. Many grumbled. Some left without farewells. Those who stayed learned to speak less and listen more. One afternoon, the widow returned from the market, fuming that a neighbor was questioning the lacemaker's business. How, they wondered aloud, could a woman alone afford fine candles in a season of shortages? The widow defended her fiercely, but warned her to lie low for a while, to keep doors bolted and coins well hidden. Distrust spread faster than any wind off the bay. That night, knocking came at her door, soft but quick, like someone counting seconds. When she opened it, Eves stood there, pale, thinner than before. His right arm hung in a sling. His once boisterous grin was gone. He had returned from the western coast, he said, with nothing but debts and stories no one would believe. Smugglers had pressed him into service, men he couldn't name, and he'd fled after seeing one of them killed in argument over hidden cargo. The dead man's name, he added in a whisper, was the same as on one of the carved initials from her fragment. She let him in. He hardly noticed the compass glinting faintly on the shelf. By the fire's uncertain light,
His tail spilled out like seawater through a cracked hull, a network stretching from village to port, led by officials as eager as thieves. The ship that had wrecked was theirs, carrying contraband disguised as parish donations. The storm had exposed them, but instead of shame, they found fury at one another, at fate, at whoever might have seen too much from the shore that night. When he finished, silence filled the room thick as smoke.
He looked at her then, his eyes begging absolution she could not offer. "They'll come here," he said. "I heard your name."
For a long time she didn't move. Her mind measured the words like stitches, one after another, forming a pattern she had feared yet could not stop weaving. Finally she stood, crossed the room, and took the compass in her hand. The needle steadied at once, pointing east toward the sea. "Then we'll go to the cliffs before they do," she said quietly. "If the truth lies there, let it meet daylight." They left before dawn, walking the rough path while fog clung low around the stones. From the headland they could see faint shapes below, small boats moving where no tide should allow them. Smugglers, no doubt, finishing the work that greed had half undone. The horizon gleamed thin and pale, the wind pressing chill salt into their faces. Near noon, they heard hoofbeats behind them.
Two riders approached along the ridge, the new customs man and another stranger, one carrying a ledger. Their coats were fine, too fine for common inspection duty. When they saw the pair, they slowed, pretending civility, but smiling too easily. The tall man greeted the lacemaker by name and asked to see her permit for rural travel. His accent carried city cruelty, courtesy sharpened to wound. She answered that she was gathering plants for dye, a harmless lie. He watched her eyes as she spoke, then shifted his gaze to Eve. Something hungry flickered there, the satisfaction of knowledge concealed. "It seems," he said softly, "certain villagers have taken to wandering at inconvenient hours. The prefecture frowns on such habits." The other man spoke then, voice low. "It begins with a shipwreck, they say." In that moment she understood what the compass had been meant to do. The stranger, the one who'd left it, must have known this day would come. Perhaps it was never a gift, but a key, its direction fixed not on north, but on truth itself. She opened her hand, letting it swing. The needle quivered, pointing again toward the line of caves beneath the cliffs. If the officials noticed, they said nothing. They dismissed her with veiled warnings, then rode on. Still, Eves trembled beside her, fear climbing his throat. "They'll come back," he whispered, "and not to ask politely." That night they hid the carvings beneath a flat rock near the beach. The tide washed close, erasing footprints, erasing certainty. She watched the surf rise, its foam cold and luminous. For a breath she thought she saw shapes, the outline of a hull deep below, perhaps, or merely light twisting through water. She wondered if the sea kept records, as humans did, or if it preferred indifference. Back home, the house felt smaller. Rain pressed against the shutters. The widow coughed in the next room, unaware of any danger nesting in her roof. Eve sat by the fire, defeated, muttering that he would leave again when the night cleared. She said nothing, only watched him drift into uneasy sleep. Then she took her lace cushion and began a new pattern. Narrow bands, crossing and linking like hidden paths, each knot deliberate. She worked through the night. When the candle burned short,
She looked down and found that almost without thinking she had recreated the alignment of the cipher. But there, within it, her own addition. A small circle stitched beside the lines, hollow and plain. Not a mark from the code, but her own sign. At dawn, Eves was gone. His footprints led toward the cliffs, then vanished in rain. The widow found his cap near the path and crossed herself. Some said the sea had taken him, others that he'd escaped with guilt as his mast. The lacemaker said nothing. Her silence became part of village talk, part fear, part pity. People began to treat her with careful kindness, as though she carried misfortune in her apron. Weeks passed. The officials left as swiftly as they'd arrived. The storm they brought with them settled into rumor. Yet at night she still heard distant creaking through the shutters. Not wind, not boats. Something older, the sound of truth adrift, unwilling to sink. One evening, when she opened the drawer, the compass was gone. In its place lay only the spool of blue thread from her youth, loosened slightly, as though someone had unwound it by hand. She touched it and felt the faintest tremor. Motion without source, life without body. In the quiet, she understood what all her patterns had been teaching her, that every tangle hides a line moving somewhere pure beneath. Outside, the tide began to rise again, patient and unstoppable. She turned back to her work. Her lamp burned steady, its light trembling on the window glass, as though breathed from the sea itself, searching once more for an answer it had already claimed and buried deep. The wind returned without warning, crawling first through the alleys, then cresting into a steady moan across the harbor roofs. By nightfall, the tide had risen high enough to bite at the stone pier, and the villagers shuttered their windows, muttering of omens. It had been months since the customs men left, but their departure had not brought peace. The air carried unfinished tension, a hum too quiet for language, but too constant for sleep. The lacemaker felt it before the first wave struck the cliffs. Her needles would not obey that evening. Thread tangled, slipped, tightened wrongly. At last she set them aside and opened her door to the wind. It came salt, damp, and sharp, smelling of seaweed and something older, that same metallic scent that had filled the air the night the ship was lost. She thought she saw lightning beyond the headland, though the sky above her was clean. The widow appeared with a lantern, her shawl tied tight under her chin. "It's coming from the south again," she said, blinking against the gust. "Same as before." Together they watched lamps kindling along the shoreline, small sparks swallowed fast by advancing dark. The widow grumbled about fishermen gone mad and hurried back inside, locking each bolt twice. The lacemaker lingered. There was a rhythm in the roar of the wind, almost a pulse, rising, pausing, answering itself. She went back to her table and unfolded the lace pattern she had begun weeks ago, a circular design unlike her usual commissions, drawn from memory of the carvings. Lines crossed, curved, doubled back. She worked one thread, then stopped. On impulse, she took the spool of blue she had kept since girlhood and used it for the final row. The color blazed in lamplight, small as a vein but bright as a wound. Outside, the storm thickened. Roof tiles lifted and fell with hollow claps. Somewhere near the quay, hooves clattered. Horses or carts hurried inland. Through the noise came another sound, distant but distinct, a single blast of a horn from the direction of the headland. Once, twice, then silence. She stepped to the window, her own reflection trembling in the glass. A flicker of light marked the cliffs, steady, deliberate, a signal, or the illusion of one. She wrapped her shawl and left the house without thinking. Rain met her halfway down the slope, slicing cold through the air. The path was slick, the stones turning underfoot. At the base of the hill, the beach lay half erased by surf. Somewhere in the distance, gulls screamed and vanished into dark. She found herself running, her lantern useless against the wind, the wick extinguished after only a few steps. Near the old storage huts, she saw shapes moving. Men, 2 or 3, dragging a cart toward the rocks where the caves began. She kept to the shadows, heart hammering in rhythm with the tide. Lightning flared behind them, revealing what they carried. Chests wrapped in oilcloth, marked faintly with the same carved signs she had once stitched by mistake. Smugglers again, or those who survived them. Among them she recognized neither Eve's nor the stranger. But one face stood out even in the brief light. The tall customs officer who had once accused her on the cliffs. Her first instinct was to turn back, but she froze when he lifted a pistol toward the water, firing once into the wind. A red spark answered from the sea, the reflection of another signal. They were meeting someone offshore. She crouched behind the rock, clutching her shawl. Thunder swallowed sound. Rain blurred outlines to smears of motion. Then came another flash, not from lightning but from fire. One of the chests burst as it struck a rock, scattering dark liquid into the surf. Smoke rose, thick and oily, tasting of tar and spices. The men cursed, struggling to right what remained. A second blast followed, louder, nearer, not from the shore but from the waterline itself. The boat they waited for had collided against rock. Lanterns rolled into waves and vanished. Someone screamed a warning, cut short by thunder's echo. In the confusion, the customs officer turned uphill, his pistol still in hand, his silhouette black against light. For an instant his gaze met hers. He shouted something lost to the storm and began toward her. She fled, climbing the slope, blind, scraping her palms on the wet cement of the path. The sea behind her raged, swallowing shouts and splashes as easily as if none had happened. At the crest she slipped, striking ground hard enough to draw blood from her knee, but she did not stop until she reached her cottage and barred the door. Inside, the lamp still burned where she had left it. On the cushion lay the unfinished lace, blue thread glinting faintly. She sank to her knees beside it, breath short, unsure whether the moisture on her face was rain or fear. The noise outside deepened, waves hammering, doors slamming, voices half drowned. She thought she heard one name rise and die in the wind, but could not tell whose. As dawn thinned the sky, the storm weakened. When people ventured out, the sea had withdrawn, leaving its offerings on the sand. Wreckage again, though lesser. Barrels split and empty, clothing torn to ribbons, a few unidentifiable bones. The warehouse stood partly collapsed, smoke curling from its beams. No one saw the customs officer after that night. The widow claimed he had ridden inland. Others said the sea took him too. The lacemaker walked to the cliffs at first light. Pools of salt water gleamed in the hollows, reflecting the gray sky. Among them she found a single object washed clean of ash, the small brass compass lodged between stones. She lifted it, expecting rust, but the glass remained clear. The needle pointed seaward, twitching faintly as if restless to continue its search. For a long while she stood there, holding it. Below, the waves flung foam against the rocks, careless and eternal. The patterns they left were already being erased. Yet even as they vanished, she saw rhythm, repetition, memory in motion. That same rhythm ran through the lace she had finished the night before, through her days, her fears, her quiet endurance. When she returned home, she placed the compass beside the driftwood fragments. Together they looked harmless, mere scraps of the sea. She trimmed the final threads of her lace, folded it neatly, and slipped it into the drawer with them. No ceremony, no prayer, just the deliberate act of closing one story within another. Outside, villagers worked to clear the beach. Children laughed when they found shells shaped like stars, their cries drifting up with seabirds. Life, indifferent, resumed its shoreward routine. The widow stopped by with soup, talking of lost roofs, broken boats, and blessings salvaged. The lacemaker listened quietly, grateful for ordinary noise. That evening, when the sun broke weakly through clouds, she hung her damp shawl by the window. Light filtered through its weave, soft and uneven. In that light, all her years unfolded in calm sequence. Childhood by the fire, youth bent over thread, storms endured, mysteries half solved and half forgiven. The sea, still restless even in calm, glimmered at the horizon. It would rise again someday, devouring memory and giving it back in fragments. But for now, it slept. She watched until color drained from the sky, then turned down the lamp before the last flame died. In darkness, she listened to the faint ticking of the cooling stove, steady, familiar, human. Beyond it came only the sound of the tide, retreating softly, as though gathering strength for another return. Years softened everything. The stones of the quay, the timbers of the houses, even the once bright sound of the market bells. Time moved in small, circular steps, like the sea tracing the same shore again and again, wearing it smooth. The village changed little, though new roofs rose where old ones sank, and children who had once scavenged shells now mended nets with their own apprentices eager at their knees. The lacemaker's cottage still faced the harbor, though salt and rain had painted its walls the color of parchment. Inside, the air smelled of soap and flax, warm and faintly sweet. On the windowsill rested her tools, bobbins polished by decades of touch, a small wooden box that once held blue thread, and beside it, the driftwood fragments now pale as bone. She rose early, not from duty but from habit. Years of dawn work had trained her body to meet the first light without argument. The mornings were thinner now, quieter. She brewed tea over the coals and watched the sea shimmer beneath the waking clouds. It no longer frightened her. Its moods had become familiar. The soft lapping that marked calm days, the long sigh before rain, the stillness that sometimes preceded sudden squalls. All tempers she could read without fear. Two young girls often came to her door for lessons, daughters of neighbors who believed lace-making finer work than gutting fish. They brought coarse laughter, news from the pier, small scandals disguised as idle chatter. She let them talk while they worked, guiding their fingers when threads slipped. The craft demanded patience most of all, and patience could not be taught with scolding. Sometimes she told them that lace was nothing but light held still for a moment. They laughed at that too, thinking it a poet's notion, and she smiled, not correcting them. The compass still sat on the shelf, no longer glinting but steady, its needle resting on east.
Once or twice a season she wound it in her palm, as though expecting the brass to warm with memory. When it failed to do so, she placed it back gently. Its quiet weight reminded her that some mysteries, when solved, lose nothing by remaining unsaid. The past had shrunk to fragments, Eve's laughter echoing half-forgotten through the tavern door, the widow's sharp mutter over herbs and coins, the stranger's half-smile as he traced the lines of the coast with ink-stained fingers. She no longer knew which of them lived, which had vanished, which were stories mistaken for lives. Memory had its own tide, receding and returning without notice. Still, there were evenings when the wind off the cliffs carried faint sounds, a rhythmic knocking like distant oars. Then her heart paused between beats, aware of something more ancient than her own story. It was not fear, but recognition, the reminder that fate repeated itself in waves long after those who first felt it were gone. The town itself endured many small reforms. A new priest arrived, younger and gentler, preaching that charity was the only oath worth renewing. He visited her once a fortnight, claiming the path to her cottage cleared his head. They drank tea together in unhurried silence. He admired the patterns she wove, though he confessed to seeing more confusion than design in them. "It must take faith," he said once, "to labor in such fineness, not knowing the whole until the end." She replied that lace and life shared the same rule. Mistakes vanished when you looked from far enough away. He laughed softly, not mocking her, and made no sermon of it afterward. In time she grew slower with the bobbins. Threads slipped more often, her hands cramped. But she found comfort in repetition, the rhythm of work as steady as her own breath. Each finished piece seemed a small victory against forgetting. Some she sold, others she gave to widows who still mourned the sea's taking. The village women began to say her lace brought luck. Brides lined up outside her door. She let them believe it. People needed symbols that spoke because life seldom did. One mild evening, she walked down to the shore. Children chased waves in the last light, their laughter scattering with the gulls. The same stones that once bruised her bare feet now felt kind beneath her boots. The old wreck site lay invisible beneath calm water, marked only by a single buoy that dipped idly in the swell. She watched it for a long time. The sunset spread across the horizon like spilled dye, streaks of rose fading into pewter. It reminded her of the colored strand she had once dared to hide from her aunt, that bit of blue brighter than sense, which she kept even when everything else had been traded away. The same blue now appeared in the sky's reflection at her feet, trembling but whole. She bent to pick up a flat stone and turned it in her palm. Its surface had been smoothed by years of surf until it felt warm despite the chill air. She set it atop another, half buried in sand, steadying them both. The gesture felt like a quiet mark of gratitude, not to saints or storms, but to the slow persistence that had carried her through each reckoning. On her return home, the girl she taught had left a note, a scrap of parchment marked by pinpricks into a childish heart shape. Beside it, 3 small shells formed a triangle.
She placed them on the mantel, beside the compass and driftwood. The collection looked strange to others, perhaps, but to her it felt complete. Artifacts of years bound together by unseen hands. Later that night, she worked by firelight, finishing a narrow length of lace, her last order before winter. Each loop caught a glimmer of orange light, shifting with her heartbeat.
She thought of all the hands that would hold the cloths she'd made, all the faces who would never know hers, and it filled her not with sadness, but with quiet pride. Creation, she realized, was its own remembrance. When the candle burned to a stub, she stood and opened the shutters. The bay glistened under a pale half-moon, its surface calm, almost painfully so. Somewhere afar, a bell marked midnight. She leaned on the window's edge, letting the cold brush through her fingers like thread between pins. The sea no longer asked anything of her. It simply existed, vast, steady, capable of both mercy and hunger. And in that understanding lay her peace, that a life, no matter how small, could learn to mirror the horizon, infinite when seen with quiet eyes. She closed the shutters, set her work aside, and went to rest. The room smelled faintly of smoke and salt. On the table, the compass needle fluttered once, then stilled. Beyond the wall, the waves curled in the dark, whispering over sand the same patient rhythm she had carried all her days. Dawn would come soon, a thin light slipping through the seams of the shutters, gilding the threads, edging the driftwood silver again. And when it did, the world would look almost unchanged. Yet within that calm, something unseen would remain, the trace of pattern completed, the proof that even fragile hands can leave behind a shape that holds.